Okay, this is Steve Bresnehan here. I'm the Fire Officer with Hobart City Council. This presentation is a quick overview of the fire management plan, the way we do it. It is a recipe rather than the recipe, and this process has been evolving for some years to suit the exact way that we operate. So take this one as an example rather than a hard and fast way to go about things. Okay, so for here, reserve management, if we were looking at the overall flow of responsibilities and requirements, at the legislation level, we've got a whole suite of federal and state legislation, ranging from things like the Fire Service Act itself, Weed Management Act, Forest Practices Act, the Threatened Species legislation, the Aboriginal Relics Act, the Nature Conservation Act, bylaws, regulations, and the Wellington Park Act as well, which doesn't come into play for Mount Nelson, but there you go. Underneath that is the policy and strategy level, which takes a lot of the responsibilities as well as the community's expectations and the intentions of the council, the policy decisions that they've made. Those are all wrapped up in visions and strategic plans, which themselves filter down into bushland management strategies and fire management strategies that we maintain. Off to the side, there are other policy and strategy level documents from other organisations, in this case the Forest Practices Code, Parks and Wildlife's operational guidelines for management burns, the Tas Fire Services bushfire planning guidelines. There are others, but those are the main ones. Everything at that level is then gathered up and filters down into individual reserve management plans and fire management plans that become the documents that take everything that is committed to above that line and spits out a unit plan and a range of activities that are actually on ground. So things like responding to wildfire, staff capability, abatement programs, maintenance programs, fire trails, management burns themselves. That cascade of responsibility is complex, and it is also perhaps difficult to see all of the arms that go into it, but that's the structure within the legislation the fire management plans have to work under. So, fire management plans themselves. It's a typical solution to the problem of assembling all the required information and coordinating the activities in natural areas. Each organisation developed its own, and more often than not it could form part of ISO 9001 accredited quality assured processes. Hobart City Council has gone down the route of large comprehensive fire management plans incorporating many wider land management issues on top of the purely fire risk related. Components. Okay, invariably they start off with a big description of the area, what it is, what's there, then goes through the policy and legal framework, assesses the bushfire risks, the history, the threats, the assets that need protecting, the ignition points historically. Weeds are always a big issue to sort out. Threatened species, other ecological values come in for attention. On top of that, you've got the recreational, visual, cultural, amenity values, all of those community values if you like. All of that get wrapped up into a strategy for works and how they're to be implemented. So burns, defendable space, weed control works, trail management, and these all have to be done in a framework that allows for adaptation and dealing with contingencies. A plan has to be a document that allows for a measure of flexibility to deal with situations as they arise. And of course monitoring. You have to know how to determine whether the plan is actually working. So the major activities. Burns. Those are the things that everyone sees and talks about to great length, but there's also defendable space, the reserve edge fire breaks and so forth. There is access both for management and also for wildfire response. There's the availability of water, there's the requirements for weed control, there's any specific values pertinent to each spot within the reserve that needs attention. There's the management of development on the fringe of the reserves, and again monitoring. So Planned burns themselves. Things you need to know. What are the assets at risk for any burn that you're going to do? What are the likely ignition points and the orientation of these to topography and wind? For Tasmania, that means particularly paying attention to what the hot summer northwesterlies will be doing. You need to know the fuel accumulation rates. How quickly after a fire does each vegetation community build up to the point where it requires the next burn to bring the fuel levels down to a manageable spot? You also need to know the ecology, the fire ecology of the vegetation communities involved. And in many cases, a burn will have a few target species that are either being actively promoted or actively suppressed as part of the burn program. They could be promoting a threatened species or suppressing a weed species. And you actually need to know that you have the organisational capacity to actually do the work. That capacity issue is one that many local government areas can hit up against. Okay, so planned burns. The sites are prepared in the off-season, including preliminary weed controls. There are burn plan requirements from the fire service that have to be dealt with and submitted. There are other permits that need to be gotten, particularly threatened species, Aboriginal cultural heritage. Neighbourhood liaison is a critical thing to do before the burn takes place, and once everything is in order, you have to wait for the right weather conditions to allow you to do the burn safely and effectively. On the day, there is media and stakeholder notifications to make sure everyone knows what's going on, and then after the burn, mopping up and monitoring for several days afterwards. And typically there will be areas of weeding that need to be sorted out, and they can be done 1, 3, 5 years after the burn. It really depends on each spot and its individual requirements. And then once all is in order, the weather is just right, you can fill the sky with a column of smoke just like we did there. Right, as an aside, fuel accumulation. Over time, the fine fuel load will build up to a point where it will reach a quasi-steady state. It is not a true steady state, it is just responding to the individual situation of each spot, accession and growth of fine fuel versus decomposition and removal of it. So, a patch of bush will be just quasi-ing along, and then the fire will occur and the fuel load drops enormously. There's always a little bit of residue left immediately afterwards, but then after that the vegetation community starts to recover. So you go through this steady recovery and regrowth phase before returning to a quasi-steady state. Now, if that grey dotted line there was actually the fuel load at which you could safely control a wildfire to protect the nearby assets, and you've got, in this case, the example shows a vegetation community with a fine fuel load of greater than that, then typically that can be used as a point to apply the next fire along to remove that fuel down to a safe level. And so a fire will occur, it'll recover, it hits that point again, burn it again, it recovers, burn it again, it recovers, burn it again, and so on. And that gap between one burn and the next is the fire interval. Now, each species in an area will have its own suite of responses to fire, from grow like crazy and recover really quickly to die and be dead forever. The more fire adapted species will recover faster, and it gets to the point where a fire interval of a duration shorter than the recovery time of any species will remove that species in fairly quick time. Too short an interval can promote flammable species over the less flammable ones, making the site more risky as time goes on. So the burns need to be tied into the ecological requirements of the vegetation community, and those can range anywhere from a few years for the grassy communities to a few centuries for wet sclerophyll forest. So, defendable space. This is critical in being the last line of defence from the edge of the bush into the properties themselves. They're always next to at-risk assets. If you don't have to have one, you don't put them in. In a fire, these defendable spaces decrease the thermal and flame attack potential for the nearby assets, but they don't have any real effect on ember attack. These spaces often act as buffer zones between the intact bush and built-up areas in both directions, often protecting the intact bush reserve further in from garden escape species and things like that. So the loss of bush values in the defendable space is traded off against improved bush values further into the reserve. The size of the defendable space determined on a case-by-case basis to be only as big as necessary. It's got to be big enough to do the job and as small as it can be otherwise. And it does require an ongoing annual works commitment, and that isn't necessarily cheap. So fire trails are not only the key asset for getting fire trucks and so forth in to fight a fire when one's on, but it's also the main network for the management during the normal running of the reserves. So having a decent network, well maintained, upgraded where necessary, redundant tracks closed or repurposed is a key asset in the whole fire management story. As is water points, knowing where the water holes are, how good they are, whether they need to be upgraded. For the case of Mount Nelson, it's very quick to drive out of the bush reserve and into the suburb and get straight onto the reticulated water. So that's actually a very handy thing for this particular area. Specific issues. Each area within a reserve will have its unique character, and that'll bring a set of issues and values that are different in quality and quantity to other places. Preparing a burn in particular involves knowing these and planning around them. Typical issues: threatened species, cultural heritage, social and other stakeholder issues. Smoke management is also a major issue that has to be managed with burning. Many of them require specific approvals from other agencies, permits, consultations, things which can take a good while to get sorted. And some reserves are actually highly complex in this regard, and the Queen's Domain Fire Management Plan is a good example of this. It's a free download off the Council website if you want to have a look. Reviewing and updating fire management plans. They should be treated as an evolving document with an inbuilt flexibility to adapt as situations alter on the ground. Annual reporting is very handy, keeping the fire services up to date on what burns and defendable space works have been done, so that their response to an emergency can be coordinated knowing that they exist. Community and stakeholder agency involvement is critical in the review and update phase. You have to actually have everyone involved to get proper buy-in of what's going to be done. Record keeping and monitoring is essential, and for spatial land management works like this, GIS is a very handy thing to have. So, there's the obligatory picture of people setting fire to things again, and we'll wind it up there.